Hello, my friends. The war in Ukraine is not just a regional conflict on the edge of Europe. It has become the central battlefield in a much older struggle. The attempt by a Western imperial establishment, led intellectually and structurally from London and Brussels, to contain, fragment, and ultimately neutralize Russia as a sovereign power on the Eurasian landmass. What is changing now dramatically is not Russia's position, but Washington's. For decades, the United States marched in lockstep with the same rules-based order ideology that dominates the British foreign policy establishment and its satellites in Brussels, Berlin, and Paris. Ukraine was weaponized as a battering ram against Russia, first via color revolutions, then via NATO encroachment, and finally through open proxy war. But the new U.S. national security strategy under Trump marks a sharp departure from that line. On paper, it still contains plenty of boilerplate about deterrence and American leadership. In substance, it signals something very different, a refusal to continue underwriting Europe's war against Russia at America's expense. Ukraine as a disposable weapon. To understand the present split, you have to start with Europe's strategy, especially the British version of it. London and its allies never cared about Ukraine as a country. They cared about Ukraine as a tool. The goal has been very clear for more than a century in Anglo-American strategic thought: prevent any unified sovereign power from dominating Eurasia. In practical terms, that has meant trying to weaken, partition, or balkanize Russia so that no independent pole can emerge to challenge Western hegemony across the heartland. Ukraine has been used as the spear point in that effort. By dragging Kyiv into NATO's orbit, flooding it with weapons, and embedding Western advisors, the British-led establishment turned Ukraine into an anti-Russia forward operating base. When Moscow finally drew a red line in 2022, the response was not to negotiate, but to double down. More weapons, more escalation, more rhetoric about total victory, and breaking Russia. This is why European elites insist that Ukraine must not make territorial concessions and must retain the right to join NATO. Those demands are not compatible with peace. They are designed to guarantee that the war continues, and all of this is being pursued while Ukraine is being chewed to pieces. By every serious account, Ukraine is losing the war, losing territory, losing infrastructure, and losing an appalling number of men, thousands a day at times. Yet the same European leaders who talk endlessly about values are determined to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian. Washington steps back. Against this backdrop, the new U.S. national security strategy is a rupture. Up to now, Washington was carrying most of the real burden, financing Kyiv, supplying the bulk of the high-end weaponry, underwriting the economic war on Russia, and absorbing the strategic risk. At some point, the American public had enough. When voters were given a choice between continuing the same globalist line under Kamala Harris or changing course under Trump, they chose change. Trump's style is often vulgar and unpredictable at the margins, but the strategic direction is unmistakable. The new document signals that the United States is no longer interested in endless NATO expansion right up to Russia's borders. Washington is no longer willing to bankroll a war in Ukraine that primarily serves European and especially British imperial interests. The Monroe Doctrine, prioritizing stability and dominance in the Western Hemisphere, is being reasserted over global crusades in Eurasia. In effect, the document is the opening move in a Cold War not against Russia, but between the United States and its own European allies. That is why the reaction in European capitals has been hysterical. The empire's junior partners are suddenly discovering that the metropole they relied on is walking away from their pet project in Ukraine. Europe's hysterical counterattack. The response from Europe has been to dig in and escalate politically. Instead of accepting that Ukraine must negotiate, the Europeans have framed a counter-proposal that is nothing of the sort. No territorial concessions, NATO membership remains on the table, and Russia's core security concerns are dismissed outright. In other words, Europe is telling Moscow, you must accept NATO on your doorstep. You must accept a hostile, heavily armed Ukraine aligned with your enemies. and you must accept ongoing war until you yield. This is not negotiation. It is an insistence on the very conditions that triggered the conflict in the first place. At the same time, European leaders have begun to threaten the United States itself. There has been talk of dumping trillions of dollars worth of U.S. treasuries onto the market if Washington insists on pushing for peace in Ukraine. The theory is that this would crash the price of treasuries, spike U.S. interest rates, and inflict enormous pain on the American economy, punishing Washington for refusing to continue the war. It is extortion dressed up as financial policy, and it is suicidal. The boomerang of financial blackmail, the threat to dump U.S. debt, reveals two things at once: European desperation and European blindness. Yes, unloading massive amounts of treasuries in a short period would hurt the United States. Higher rates, more expensive debt service, financial market stress, and likely a bout of inflation. But Europe is not operating in a vacuum. The Eurozone itself is heavily dependent on the dollar system. International trade in vital goods, oil, gas, coal, foodstuffs, industrial inputs is still settled primarily in dollars. European banks already struggle with dollar liquidity at times, which is why the Federal Reserve had to set up swap lines to keep them afloat. If Europe launched a full-blown financial attack on U.S. debt, Washington has an obvious counter: cut off dollar liquidity, turn off the swap lines, force European importers to scramble for dollars on open markets. The result would be catastrophic for Europe. International trade would seize up. The euro would come under immense pressure. Interest rates in Europe could spike far more violently than in the United States. Political unrest already growing would explode. It would be a classic boomerang. Europe throws a Force 1 financial weapon at the U.S. and gets a Force 5 blowback to its own face. On top of that, the Trump administration is already predisposed to tariff warfare. Give it a clear pretext, and those 15% tariffs suddenly become 500% tariffs. European exporters would be crushed. In short, the threat to dump treasuries is not a sign of strength. It is the tantrum of an elite that has lost strategic control and is lashing out in all directions. The caliber of Europe's ruling class, none of this should be surprising when you look at who actually runs Europe today. The continent is governed by a class of politicians selected not for competence, but for loyalty and malleability. The system has systematically purged serious, independent figures, especially those willing to recognize Russia's legitimate security concerns. One stark example was the German admiral, who early in the Ukraine crisis publicly suggested the obvious: the cheapest, safest solution was to acknowledge Russia's security interests and reach a settlement without war. He was fired the same day. A single moment of realism was enough to end his career. What replaces such people are yes men and yes women apparatchiks who will dutifully repeat whatever line is handed to them. Sacrifice your population's standard of living for sanctions on Russia? Yes, sir. Send your industries into collapse by cutting off cheap Russian energy? Yes, sir. Speak openly about citizens needing to sacrifice their children in a future war with Russia? Yes, sir. You can see this in the tone and demeanor of many top European officials: shallow, performative, and oddly childish. They act as if history is a stage and they are playing heroes in a moral drama, while in reality they are presiding over the degradation of their own societies and the destruction of Ukraine. Russia's leadership and the end of the old playbook. The tragedy for Europe and the opportunity for Russia is that the old imperial playbook no longer works. For more than a century, British strategy has relied on a set of familiar tools: set neighboring states against each other through alliances and side deals, use NGOs, media companies, and charities as instruments of influence and destabilization, create and support extremist proxies, whether far left, far right, or religious, to sabotage governments that resist Western directives, keep key regions in a state of permanent controlled chaos so that London and its partners can keep managing the crises and extracting leverage. This is exactly how London maneuvered Europe into World War I. Intense and secret assurances pushed France, Russia, Italy, and others into a war that primarily served British strategic needs. The same pattern can be seen in more recent decades. Intelligence-linked NGOs funding provocations in the Balkans from both sides. Color revolutions in the post-Soviet space. Jihadist networks redeployed across regions. And now neo-Nazi formations in Ukraine used as shock troops against Russia. But the critical difference today is that Russia and other targeted states like China and Iran have read the playbook. They understand the method. They know how London and its satellites operate through proxies, hidden hands, and deceitfully framed values rhetoric. Russia's leadership, whatever one thinks of it, is professional and historically literate. They are not dealing with European elites as partners, but as a hostile, manipulative power center that has been trying to break Russia for generations. That clarity shapes Russia's strategy in Ukraine. Russia will not accept NATO on its border. Russia will not tolerate a hostile, Western-armed Ukraine used as a permanent threat. Russia will grind through the Ukrainian military as long as necessary until those realities are recognized. Ukraine, Israel, and the wider imperial war. Although the user asked to focus on Russia and Ukraine, it is important to note one broader point that directly affects this battlefield. The empire sees multiple conflicts. Ukraine, the Middle East, pressure on China as theaters of the same overarching war. When George Soros spoke in 2021 about a clash between open and closed societies, he was giving a sanitized ideological label to a very concrete geopolitical struggle. The global empire versus sovereign states that refuse to be vassals. In practice, that means Russia, China, Iran, and others are all on the same target list. Ukraine is simply the front line against Russia. Others are attacked via sanctions, proxies, or hybrid means. From Moscow's perspective, the message is clear. If Russia falls, the rest will be picked off one by one. That is why Russia cannot afford to lose in Ukraine and why it is prepared to endure sanctions, economic warfare, and Western hysteria rather than retreat. A new strategic reality for Washington? The irony is that Washington, under Trump, is partly waking up to the fact that this crusade against Russia no longer serves America's own interests. The United States is not the undisputed, unchallenged giant it was when it invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. It is overextended, heavily indebted, and facing a rapidly changing global environment where BRICS, China, and the broader global South offer alternative economic and political arrangements. Continuing an unwinnable proxy war against Russia in Ukraine on behalf of European elites who treat America as hired muscle is not sustainable. That is the logic behind the new national security strategy's shift away from Ukraine as a primary project and toward a narrower focus on American priorities in its own hemisphere. But because this shift is happening inside a system full of entrenched interests, the military-industrial complex, Atlanticist think tanks, intelligence networks, the result is often confusing from the outside. Trump uses asymmetric methods, public statements that sound hostile to Russia, mixed messages and documents, and back-channel envoys to Moscow whom he personally trusts because he cannot rely on the bureaucracy. From Russia's side, this looks chaotic and sometimes contradictory. But the underlying trend is real. Washington is stepping back from Europe's project in Ukraine. Where this leaves Ukraine and Russia. For Ukraine itself, this is catastrophic. Its Western backers in Europe are determined to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, while its main backer in Washington is edging toward the exit. Kyiv's leadership still speaks in absolutist terms. No territorial concessions, NATO or nothing, because that is what London and Brussels want to hear. On the ground, however, Ukraine is bleeding out. Its army is being destroyed. Its demographics are being shattered. Its infrastructure is being systematically dismantled. Russia, by contrast, has clarity of purpose, strategic depth, and a leadership that understands both the immediate military situation and the longer historical struggle. For Moscow, this is not just about Donetsk or Kherson. It is about ensuring that Russia remains a sovereign pole on the Eurasian continent. immune to the kind of partition and subjugation that Western strategists have openly fantasized about. The British-led imperial establishment is still playing its old game: proxies, manipulation, permanent war. But the players have changed. Russia is no longer the weak, chaotic state of the 1990 seconds. China is not a peripheral actor, but a central economic powerhouse. The global South is no longer a passive spectator. And crucially, the United States, however clumsily, is starting to pull away from Europe's doomed attempt to use Ukraine to break Russia. The empire is losing its instrument. Seen from this angle, the war in Ukraine is not just about lines on a map. It is about whether the old imperial model centered on London, Brussels, and their networks can still use states like Ukraine as disposable weapons against sovereign powers like Russia. The answer is increasingly no. Europe lacks the military, financial, and political capacity to sustain a long war without American muscle. Washington no longer has the appetite to bleed for a project that benefits Europe more than itself. Russia refuses to accept the strategic encirclement and humiliation that this project requires. In that sense, the empire is losing its instrument. Ukraine has been sacrificed, but Russia has not been broken. The longer Europe clings to its fantasies of total victory and regime change in Moscow, the more isolated and hysterical it will become. Russia, meanwhile, is playing a long game, absorbing blows, adapting to sanctions, deepening ties with non-Western partners, and methodically grinding down the forces set against it in Ukraine. The West wanted to make Ukraine the graveyard of Russian power. Instead, it risks making Ukraine the graveyard of its own imperial illusions.